On the morning of June 13th, 1886, the body of a king was found floating in the waist-deep waters of Lake Starnberg. Beside him lay his psychiatrist, dead from unknown causes. There were no bullet wounds. There were no signs of a struggle. This was the tragic end of Ludwig II of Bavaria, a man who spent his life fleeing a reality he couldn't control, only to be consumed by a mystery that remains unsolved to this day.
He was called the Moon King, the Dream King, and most famously, the Mad King. But to understand how a monarch ends up face down in a lake, we must look back at a life spent building fairy tales in a world of iron and blood.
Ludwig was born in 1845 at Nymphenburg Palace, the eldest son of King Maximilian II of Bavaria. From the moment he could speak, it was clear he was different. While other princes were taught the arts of war and governance, Ludwig was obsessed with the arts of the imagination. He grew up in the shadow of the Alps, specifically at Hohenschwangau Castle, a fortress adorned with murals of Germanic legends and medieval knights. His childhood was one of severe discipline and deep isolation. His father was a cold man who believed in the rigors of education above all else, while his mother, Marie of Prussia, struggled to understand her son's brooding, sensitive nature. Ludwig found his solace in the stories of the Holy Grail and the Swan Knight, Lohengrin. He didn't just read these stories, he inhabited them. By the time he was 18, his world changed forever. His father died suddenly, and the tall, strikingly handsome teenager was thrust onto the throne of Bavaria. He was the most eligible bachelor in Europe, a king who looked like a poet, standing over 6 feet tall with dark, curling hair and intense, dreaming eyes. The crowds adored him. They saw a new era of romanticism. But Ludwig didn't want to lead a nation. He wanted to live in a poem. His first act as king would define his reign and his reputation. He summoned the composer Richard Wagner to Munich. Ludwig cleared Wagner's debts and became his greatest patron. This wasn't just about music. It was about the king finding a soul who shared his obsession with myth. Together, they planned to transform Munich into a world capital of the arts. But the Bavarian government saw it differently. They saw their young king pouring the national treasury into the pockets of a controversial artist. The pressure became so great that Ludwig was eventually forced to banish Wagner from the city, a heartbreak that further withdrew the king into his own private world. While Ludwig was dreaming of operas, the real world was becoming increasingly violent. The mid-19th century was a time of brutal geopolitics. To the north, Prussia was rising under the leadership of Otto von Bismarck, a man of blood and iron. Bavaria was caught in the middle. In 1866, Ludwig was forced into a war against Prussia. He hated it. Bavaria lost, and with that loss, Ludwig lost his true sovereignty. He was no longer a fully independent king. He was a vassal of the Prussian-led German Empire. This was the turning point. If Ludwig couldn't be a real king with real power, he would build a kingdom where his word was absolute. He began to retreat from Munich, spending more and more time in the mountains. He started to build. His first great project was Neuschwanstein. Rising from a jagged cliffside, it was designed not as a defensive fortress or a seat of government, but as a monument to the operas of Wagner and the legends of the Middle Ages. It was a palace of the mind, a place where Ludwig could pretend that the 19th century didn't exist. But one castle wasn't enough. He built Linderhof, a jewel box of a palace inspired by Versailles and the French Sun King Louis XIV. Here, Ludwig lived out his most eccentric fantasies. He had a dining table hideaway installed, a mechanical floor that allowed his dinner table to be lowered into the kitchen and raised back up fully set, so he wouldn't have to see or speak to any servants. He would dine alone, setting places for the ghosts of French royalty, conversing with the spirits of the past while the wind howled outside. Then came Herrenchiemsee, an even grander tribute to Versailles, built on an island in the middle of a lake.
As the years passed, Ludwig's behavior became more erratic. He turned nocturnal, sleeping during the day and riding through the snowy mountains at night in elaborate gilded sleighs, dressed in historical costumes. He stopped attending public functions. He grew heavy, his once handsome features masked by a beard and the visible weight of his isolation. The Bavarian government was in a panic. The king had exhausted his personal fortune and was beginning to borrow heavily. While the castles were technically his private property, his creditors were getting restless, and the ministers feared the monarchy itself would be dragged into bankruptcy. They needed a way to remove him.
In June 1886, a commission of state-appointed doctors, led by Dr. Bernhard von Gudden, declared Ludwig II of Bavaria insane. The tragedy of this diagnosis was that none of the doctors had actually examined the king. They relied on hearsay and the king's well-known eccentricities. They labeled him with paranoia.
On June 12th, the commission arrived at Neuschwanstein to take the king into custody. Ludwig was trapped in his own fairy tale. He was transported to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg, essentially a prisoner in his own land. He was devastated. He told his servants, "I cannot live without my mountains." The following evening, June 13th, Ludwig asked Dr. Gudden to join him for a walk along the lake. The doctor, confident in his control over the Mad King, told the guards to stay back. The two men disappeared into the evening mist. When they didn't return after several hours, a search party was sent out.
In the flickering light of torches, they found their answer. The king's jacket and overcoat were found on the shore. Further out in the water, the bodies of both Ludwig and Dr. Gudden were discovered. The official report claimed it was a suicide by drowning and that Dr. Gudden had died trying to stop him. But the facts didn't fit. Ludwig was a strong swimmer. The water where he was found was barely waist deep. There was no water found in his lungs during the autopsy. Furthermore, Dr. Gudden's body showed signs of a struggle, bruises on his head and neck. To this day, many believe Ludwig was murdered by his political enemies, or that he was shot while trying to escape across the lake to a waiting carriage. The royal family has never allowed a modern forensic examination of the king's body, leaving the truth submerged in the cold waters of Starnberg.
The legacy of Ludwig II is one of the great ironies of history. At the time of his death, he was mocked as a failure and a madman. Today, those very same castles are the primary drivers of the Bavarian economy. Neuschwanstein is one of the most visited buildings on Earth, the direct inspiration for Walt Disney's Sleeping Beauty castle.
Ludwig II was a man who was born in the wrong century. He was a romantic in an age of industry, a dreamer in an age of bureaucrats. He left behind a world of stone and shadow that continues to captivate the human imagination. He was the fairy tale king, a man who built his dreams in the clouds because the earth beneath his feet was too cold to bear. If you want to dive deeper into the mysteries of history, subscribe.